I know, but it's unfortunate that, a year and a half ago, I tried to sit on Sarah's figure drawing class, and I made it through about the first 5 weeks until I realized I really did not have 2.5 hours twice a week to give to this. Right? It's just the way life is. Um, anyway, back to the long and the short of it is, if you don't know your way around printmaking, be sure you pay attention to those other two readings that aren't about Rembrandt but are about printmaking processes, because we will be talking about that on Friday as well. Okay. The way this is set up, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to get through this material in 7 weeks, which is really kind of a semester's worth of material in 7 weeks. And what I'm probably going to do is to familiarize you with a lot of different pictures by the different artists we'll look at, and really only dive into depth on one or two of them, if that makes sense, right? So there may be ones where you feel free to ask questions, right? But I'm not going to explain every picture that we see in great depth, simply because there's no way we'd get through it all, right? I once taught a class only on Rembrandt, and it took up the entire semester because there's enough to talk about. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't raise your hand and stop me, right? Hey, that's really weird. I'd like to hear more about that. And if I know, or we'll just throw it open for discussion, right? So don't hesitate to ask, right? Especially if you really want to hear something more about something, okay? So today we're going to start talking about Rembrandt. I figure we better put him first. That way we'll be sure to get to him, right? Because if Thomas can vouch, we always run behind in these classes. Here's a self-portrait. We saw this, I think, before. I'm really quite fond of this one. His early self-portraits are really dramatic, and they're almost like he's really trying to be Baroque, in enhancing the sense of drama. And he loves sort of playing with the lighting to add dramatic effect. But I particularly like it as something that he does throughout his entire career, which is it looks as if, for me, I think something about Rembrandt is that he's playing with traditional media, and I mean that quite seriously. He's playing with them. He's kind of experimenting with them. And we'll see him do this with printmaking as well. But you'll notice the way he's done his hair is that he's painted it, but then to get the highlights as the light comes in from the upper left corner of his hair, what he's done is he's turned the brush around. And he's gone back in with the heel of the brush, right? Not with the bristles, but with the heel, the wooden bit. And he's scratched into the hair. And that gives him, scratched right through the wet paint, back down to the surface on a wooden panel, right? So right back down to the surface of the preparation, the gesso on the wooden panel, to give the highlights of the hair. It's pretty tricky, right? And pretty straightforward and simple when you think about it. But it's non-traditional. He's using the brush in a way it wasn't really designed to be used. And I think that's kind of fascinating about Rembrandt here. He's only 22 years old when he did this, right? Born in 1606. So, is that right? Yeah, 1606. So, early on, right, he's already sort of experimenting with traditions. It's something we'll see him do throughout the rest of his life. Born in Leiden, we knew this from our readings, and there's Leiden on the map for you in case you want to know. And it's close enough that when we're in Amsterdam and you got an afternoon off, you can go visit it, right? Not that there's a nice museum there, but you're not going to go find where Rembrandt was born, right? His dad ran a mill. Now this, quite literally a windmill, right? It's not like running a mill now where you're, a textile mill or something like that. He milled grain for a living, right? And a lot of people suggested back in the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, when we thought biography equaled art much more closely, right? We used to think that this lower class upbringing had some impact on the sort of subject matters that Rembrandt chose, and a sort of rustic approach to painting that we'll see, a sort of rough-edged approach to painting that he developed throughout his entire career, that this rough painting, these preference for rustic subject matter, down-to-earth sort of subject matter, might well have been influenced by the fact that he had this sort of lower-class upbringing. But most artists did. Very few artists were well-born. And so when you think anymore, that's not really the case. But there still is, it's worthwhile keeping in the back of your mind that he, like many artists in the 17th, well, no, that's not true. Artists in 17th century Holland, many of them come from other fields and are sort of get into it, right? Some are born to families of artists as well. And you sort of either or, right? And Rembrandt's in the or. Does that make sense, right? He's not born to a family of artists. He, in Leiden, enrolled in university. I think that was in our reading as well, right? That the University of Leiden was a very, very prominent institution at the time, and he enrolls as a student there when he's 14 in 1620. Very soon drops out, right? It isn't there for but a semester, right, give or take, right, just a few months. And they didn't have semesters like we do, right? It wasn't set up that same way. And the reason he dropped out was not because he was a bad student, so far as we know, right? I mean, the university records would probably tell us that was the case. But rather, he dropped out because he wanted to study art. And his father supported him in this because he was showing already some talent in making art, right? So he drops out to study art because art wasn't a major then like it is now, right? Institutions were institutions of classical learning. And so the idea of being an art major or being any kind of profession, right, wasn't necessarily covered at the institution, wasn't covered at the university. So he drops out literally to become a painter, and with his father's blessing, and he begins to apprentice. This is the way you learn to paint, was you went out and got an internship, right? But a multi-year one, 3 or 4 year internship, where you would sit down with a painter who would teach you the ropes, would teach you the ins and outs of everything that went into making paintings, from buying wood. They're almost all painted on wooden panels at this point. Buying panels from the panel maker, to joining them together, to preparing the surfaces, to grinding your own paints, right? We're very much used to buying paints in little foil tubes, right? Little metal tubes. Those weren't invented until the 1840s, 1850s. So prior to that, what you would do is, if you were an artist, is you'd have some podunk assistant helping you, and they'd be grinding up the raw materials. You go down to the chemist and you'd buy these, right? You go to the apothecary, and you would buy lapis lazuli. You'd buy some scarab beetles. You'd buy plant matter. That all of these things would be dried up, ground up, mixed into a binding agent, oil, in this case, right? And that would take place in the studio. So you would have these jars filled with these different pigments, as well as the linseed oil. That was the emulsifying agent, right? That you would stir them into. So the painting that you see is a series of layers of linseed oil with pigment mixed into it, and usually applied in layers so that we can actually see through them. And there's a whole branch of art science that looks into these. We'll take microscopic cross sections so we can look at what the paint looks like, right? And that's one of the ways we can determine whether or not it's a Rembrandt, is what kind of paint they're using, right? And what you would do is you ground it up, and you would mix it in, is you would store it, the stuff you didn't use that day, in little pouches, usually made from leather, right? Or maybe gut, right? Pig's gut or something like that. That you would tie up, and that would be watertight, and then the next day you would squeeze it out of that. And this is the reason my grad class read this. You never painted outside, right? This impressionist idea of going and setting up an easel out there and painting trees simply did not happen. Everything was done in the studio because of the techniques of the studio, right? And so back to Rembrandt, he went off to apprentice, right? First with Jacob van Swanenburg, we read about that, and then second with this artist named Peter Lastman in Amsterdam. And the whole point of that, and it was normal, by the way, to go through 2 or 3 different masters on your way to studying, the whole point of that was to learn everything he would need to do when he went out on his own. And also, going out on your own was a pretty big investment, so what you're also doing is you're just kind of saving money, right? As you figure it out, making that big investment, okay? So Rembrandt in Leiden is dropping out of the institution in order to become an artist, and the whole way you became an artist was to apprentice, right? So again, he's first under this one artist, van Swanenburg, but in 1622, when he was 16, his father sent him to Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam was then, just as it is now, the most prominent city in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands. And I guess it would be like if you were from, I don't know, let's pick something. Boise, Idaho, and you wanted to be a painter. And in order to really become a good painter, you go off to New York to see what's going on in the big city, right? In the capital, where more art is being produced, where the most cutting edge stuff is being done. That's what you would do, right? And so Rembrandt goes to New York, right? He goes to Amsterdam in 1622 and stays there for about 2 years, a year and a half, 2 years, right? 1622 to 1624, Rembrandt's in Amsterdam studying painting, again, as an apprentice, right? And the apprentice he's working for is Peter Lastman, right? I'm sorry, the Wi-Fi is being slow. There we go. Peter Lassmann. You'll have to forgive, I took this picture in RM Rijksmuseum, right? RH Rembrandt House. The third one we'll see today is MH Moritz House in The Hague. And FHM will be the Frans Hals Museum. And those are about the only four you'll see, right? So that tells you things that we might see. And most of these are on view, as a matter of fact. I think I chose out the ones that are actually on view. And so I took that photo in October. You have to forgive, there's a pot on the shelf in front of it, and you can see it in the foreground. So just forget about that part, right? I couldn't place that. So he goes to study under Peter Lassmann. And this is an important step for Rembrandt on a couple of reasons. One, he's finishing up his education, on the one hand, under Lassmann. But on the other hand, Lassmann was actually he's not well known today, but in the 1610s and 20s, Lassmann was kind of like one of the biggest artists in Amsterdam, right, during that period. And so the fact that Rembrandt is able to get an apprenticeship with the most prominent painter in Amsterdam is for us evidence of something that will be true throughout his entire career. And that is that he's very, very ambitious. Rembrandt has designs to become a great painter. Okay? And Lassmann is a perfect choice for that because for two reasons. One, Lassmann is prominent, right? He's an apprentice he's the show, right? I don't know contemporary art well enough, but imagine in the 1950s you go to New York and an apprentice under Jackson Pollock, right? I mean, he's at the top of his game and very well respected, greatest clientele, right? So it's a great place to be an apprentice, right? Second thing, Peter Lassmann specialized, and all artists did specialize, right, in what we call history painting. And history painting in the 17th century was believed to be the most noble branch of painting because it required significantly more of the painter. You had to be more educated. You had to paint everything that was included in all of the other kinds of painting. You had to be good at landscape. You had to be good with still life details. You had to be good with animals. You had to be good with the human figure, right? As a history painter, you brought it all together, right? Now, the term history painting, and by the way, there were people that wrote about art in the 17th century. They all would say history painting is the most noble kind of painting. And it sort of would trickle down, right? And at the bottom were things like still life. And actually, the very bottom was portraiture, even though it paid really well. Because if you paint a portrait, I'm going to paint a portrait of Thomas. Thomas gets to tell me what to do. Because it's going to look like Thomas. It better freaking look like Thomas, or else I don't get paid, right? And you're under somebody's thumb, right? You're under somebody else's control. You don't have the kind of freedom you do in other kinds of pictures. So, portraiture is put way down at the bottom, right? So Rembrandt goes, he's going to be not only apprentice under the greatest painter in Amsterdam at the time, but he's going to be learning how to do history painting, which is the most noble kind of painting that any artist could do in the early part of the 7th century. This is very important for Rembrandt, right? He's setting himself up as a prominent artist. That's what he wants to be. And so history painting as a type of painting, right, distinct from landscape and still life and whatnot, encompassed not just historical pictures, but also encompassed biblical pictures, mythological pictures, ancient Roman gods, right, as well as historical images of national history, or even better yet, ancient Roman history, right? So it's a bigger umbrella term. It doesn't just mean historical. It means anything that's sort of narratively based and from times past, right? So here, this image is a biblical image. It's not really something you find in the Bible, right? It's elaborating on it, where Adam and Eve, we don't know who the heck the kids are, right? But here is Abel having been slain by Cain, who's nowhere to be found, right? And there's Adam and Eve looking at their dead son and realizing on a certain level that what happened to their son is their fault, right? That's the outcome of the original sin, of them eating that apple and disobeying God brought sin into the world, and that's what inspires Cain to kill Abel. It's jealousy, right? And that jealousy would not exist had Adam and Eve not upset the divine order of the Garden of Eden, okay? So they realize this, and part of the lamentation, sorrow over the dead Abel, is that idea of recognition of guilt. And Adam looks significantly more guilty than Eve, at least as I look at the picture. And that's because I think that, one, Eve got Adam to do it, but also Eve had much more pride, according to the biblical story. And artists, through the millennia, have tended to sort of make Eve worse in the whole situation than Adam. It's because it's all men, right? Blame the women. It's always their fault. It's not my fault, right? So anyway, Eve she's looking away from him, but she's still like doing her hair, because she's vain, and that's kind of how she got Adam to take the apple in the first place. Right. Another Lastman from the Rembrandt House Museum. Lastman was very good at choosing stories that weren't often illustrated, right? And finding a sort of human illustration of these biblical events or extra biblical events, right? So just as with the lamentation over Abel, Lastman focuses on the human side of the story, right? Here too, with the triumph of Mordecai, it's really about a human drama. And I had to look this one up because I'm not Jewish, and I think if you're Jewish, you probably know this one better. I took Hebrew when I was an undergrad, right? And so I went to Purim festivals in the spring, which celebrate the book of Esther, which is where this story is found, right? And I would imagine, since that holiday looms large for the Jews, that this scene would be significantly better known to them than it is to me. I had to go find out the whole story. So it's all about the exile of the Israelites in Persia under King Ahasuerus, right? And the story is that King Ahasuerus had elevated this man named Haman, he's on the right with the purple frock in the shadow, to a very, very high position in his court. But Haman was an anti-Semite, right, full of hatred for the Jews. And in particular, he hates this guy named Mordecai. And he hatches this secret plot, Haman does, to kill all the Jews, right, in Persia. And he has a special gallows built for Mordecai, who he particularly hates. He's going to make a symbol out of him. That's the story gets started, right? This is all in the book of Esther, right? Mordecai, however, right, his enemy, the guy on the horse, actually had saved the king's life. So the king was grateful to him, right? Really liked Mordecai. And in addition to that, Mordecai was the guardian of a young woman, Esther, who becomes married to King Ahasuerus. He doesn't know she's Jewish, right? He just knows she's beautiful. That's all that matters to him, right? So Mordecai's got sort of the king's favor a couple of ways over, right? Not only did he save his life, but also he's the guardian to the queen, okay? So this is not going to work out well for Haman, okay? So Haman's going to try this secret plot, kill all the Jews, string up Mordecai's special life, right? Mordecai tells Esther what's going on, okay? Esther goes to Ahasuerus, the king, in her finest clothes, dresses up really nice, right? And Ahasuerus is like, ooh, baby. And he says, I'll give you anything you want. And she says, well, make a special meal, right? Invite Haman to your special meal as well. And what she's going to do is she's going to reveal the plot, right? So there's this big meal, invites Haman. Haman says to the king, how would you give honor to somebody? Thinking the whole meal's for him, right? Because this is all Esther's plot. She's going to work on it, right? So she invite, hey, king, throw this big meal. Invite Haman, make him think he's the guest of honor. So So tell me, King, what's the best way to honor somebody? Thinking it's himself, right? And Ahasuerus says, well, you don't deserve, Mordecai deserves the honor, and this whole meal is going to honor him instead. And the best way to honor him is to dress him up in royal clothes and march him through the streets to a royal fanfare. This will give him honor, the same honor I would receive when I walk through the streets, right? And he says, in addition to this, Haman, because the plot's now been revealed, you've got to lead him through the streets as he receives all the honor. So that's the scene we're seeing here, right? Is Haman, recently shamed, angry, right? Hates Mordecai. Mordecai being led through the streets in clothes that are not his own, right? Dressed in royal finery to fanfare through the streets, right? This is the scene that Lastman chooses, right? And Lastman is particularly good at sort of human interaction, bringing to these historical images, bringing them down to earth, bringing them down to human terms. And so we see the conniving Haman on the right in green and purple looking angrily at Mordecai on horseback. Mordecai looks out at us, and there's something about the body. He's not like, showing off or anything. He's kind of humble about it all, right? And it really adds these sort of dimensions that the more you look at it, the more you start to see. It's almost like he's a little embarrassed by this whole thing, And Lasso's really good at capturing that, right? And sort of nuancing the story around its very human interaction, right? And that, for Rembrandt, is an absolutely crucial thing that he learns, right, from Peter Lastman, is this idea of how to tell a story in an engaging human way, right? That's maybe the single biggest lesson he got out of the 2 years he spends with Lastman, is that lesson. And it's something that he actually improves on, gets better on through the course of his career, right? The other thing he gets from Lastman, I think that's really crucial, is how important details are for telling the story. So on one hand, the story is told through human terms, and they flesh those all out. On the other hand, the story is told through costumes and objects that enliven the scene, right? So on the right, we've got that cute little dog on the altar, the animals. On the left, amazing turbans, right? Now, they're not historically accurate or anything like that. What Lastman would do and what artists would do would be keep a sort of a trunk full of props that they would use in the studio, dress up models and sort of come up with these compositions, right? And Rembrandt understands that as well. And in fact, as soon as he becomes an artist in his own right, Rembrandt begins to collect things for two different reasons, right? On the one hand, he has trunks and trunks and trunks of objects that end up pulling them out to dress people up, to make these studies that are nothing, they look like portraits, but they're not. They're just face costume studies. And the idea is he's getting better, right? And he's making, and I think this is a fascinating thing about Rembrandt, is he's making a sort of visual encyclopedia in the back of his head. So that when he sits down to make a painting or a composition, he knows what a guy in a turban looks like and doesn't need to dress a guy in a turban up anymore. Does that make sense? He'll do studies of people on the streets, just relentlessly drawing and drawing, so that when it comes time to draw something, he can do it without posing anybody. He's got a mental encyclopedia going, visual encyclopedia. And so he makes a series of these costume studies. This is now after he's moved to Amsterdam for good in 1631. But he still continues in the 30s to do these studies of, we think they're probably people he knew, drug them in, dressed them up, right? Probably paid them, he didn't drag them in, right? Dresses them up, and there usually is no one-to-one correspondence between these and the paintings. Every now and then, but rarely is there a one-to-one correspondence because he's not making the study for another work of art, right? What he's doing is he's practicing. But he's practicing with a finished work of art, right? The term we use for these, by the way, are tronies. The singular is still spelled I-E, and a tronie is basically a face study. And that's the terms that artists used in the 17th century for these costume face studies, is a tronie, right? So, one of the most famous works from the 17th century that we'll see, The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Vermeer, that was a book, right? It's all over the place. That was probably just a tronie, right? Just a head study in costume, right? No great mystery behind it, no Tracy Chevalier BS floating around that. It was just a head study, right? Become sort of the Mona Lisa of the North, right? So, yeah.
So you said that like he would just sit and observe people, and
Yeah.
also with his like trunk of objects. So does that mean like the people that he does paint, it just is a figment of his imagination?
No, not you. Well, that's hard to say, right? It's really difficult to say for sure. And one of the things that we'll find, and it's worth keeping in mind, just always log this in the back of mind, that what might not hold true for one work doesn't necessarily mean it holds true for all of them, right? That there's a range of possibilities out there with everything that we're going to look at. Okay, so sometimes we can explain it very, very easily. That yes, there's this, and we're pretty sure it's not that. And other times we're like, well, we don't know for sure, right? So sometimes these faces, like this guy, looks really similar to the faces that were done by Rembrandt and others back when he was enlightened. Even that sort of flat nose that comes down off the forehead, right? Big baggy eyes, beard. It looks really similar to an old man that appears in a lot of sketches and etchings, right around 1630. And this romantic idea that said that Rembrandt was rustic because of his dad also said that when we start to see the old man a lot, it's got to be his dad. Now, there's no proof of that, because we don't know what his dad looked like, right? But there's an old woman that we see a lot that has his mom, right? So usually we're pretty sure that they're people that he knew one way or another. And the reason we're pretty sure about it is some of them we can't identify. For example, there's a lot of pictures of his wife. He gets married in 1634, I think. And there's a lot of pictures of his wife dressed up in fancy costume, right? And none of them, some of them actually make her into something specific, an allegorical figure of flowers, flora, or Lucretia from ancient Roman history. They'll make her into something specific. Her name is Saskia, right? And some of them will put her into very specific guises, and other ones are just like pearls and some sort of gauzy headwear, right? And we don't know. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the bottom line is that we're pretty sure that most of these would in fact fall under the broader rubric of portrait, except that a portrait always is commissioned, right? A portrait's a different thing. A portrait is something that wealthy people commission to aggrandize themselves, right? And the beginning of the whole portrait begins with the sitter, right? The sitter instigates the whole process. It doesn't happen without that, okay? This is not a portrait in that whomever we don't think that this is a portrait because it didn't, and again, we don't know, right? We're trying to prove a negative. But given the costuming, this looks like it started with Rembrandt rather than starting with the sitter, right? Rather than being commissioned up front. Okay? And that brings up another important thing that we should keep in the back of our minds, right? In the 17th century in Holland, we talked about how wealthy they were, right? Last class. And we talked about the fact that there's this huge, broad buying public for pictures, okay? Because the wealth is distributed quite well, even though there's a gap and there's a huge amount of indolence, right? Poverty. But there is sort of, at the upper middle class level, quite a few people buying pictures. And with that comes an interest in, for artists, trying to grab part of that market is the idea of specializing, right? I used to use the analogy of sort of like Abercrombie and Fitch markets to you, but not to me. I tried their clothes on Wednesday. Fat guys in the 50s and 60s. But Gap does, and they try to do both of us. And so, the Abercrombie and Fitch model would be like you're going to do you can find one part of the market and do that well, right? The Gap model is like, hey, try to be everything to everybody. Right? Fascinating thing about Rembrandt with his intentions of being a great painter, he actually tries a little bit of everything at some point or another, right? He really wants to be a history painter, but he doesn't let that get in the way of trying landscape for a while, right? He does a couple still lives. And becomes actually very, very popular portraitist as well, right? Okay, so that's a longish answer, right? This one, we're pretty sure it's just a costume study, a trope, right? Now, let me go back to my notes. I'm so far off, right? So, Lastman's important for Rembrandt. Importance for Rembrandt, right? Importance of history painting. That's one thing he gets from Lastman, right? It's how important is history painting? The most important category of the day, Rembrandt wants to be a great painter. Biblical stories should be told as human stories, and you can enliven these even more with costumes, right? There's another Lastman lesson, okay? Lastman had been to Italy, right? Around 1610 or so, 1605, 1610, Lastman had been to Italy. He had seen Caravaggio's. He filters some of that influence into the way he sort of dramatically lights the scene. It's not really Caravaggio lighting in his Triumph of Mordecai, but the deep shadows that swallow some of the figures, in particular Haman, sort of come out of his experience with these paintings, these high Baroque paintings by Caravaggio in Italy. Right? And remember, we talked about Caravaggio on Friday. He was sort of, the most Baroque of the Baroque in a way, in the earliest part of the Baroque period, and had a huge impact on painters up north. And one of these was Peter Lastman, right? Lastman had also seen other artists while he was in Italy, and one of these that also we'll see has a long-standing influence on Rembrandt is this a German painter named Adam Elsheimer, who had also been in Italy at the same time as Lastman, right around 1610, and paints sort of highly dramatically lit religious scenes that are told sort of on human terms. So Tobias and the angel, Tobias is going out to get a fish, and the angel is guiding him back, right? But even though we have the wings on the angel, there's a sort of human element to the story, right down to the sort of rustic landscape details in the background, and that sort of nocturnal lighting at the end of the day as he's coming back and moving through the shadows, right? So Lastman is picking up on these things. So the importance of sort of Baroque style, Italian Baroque style, is something else that Rembrandt picks up for the first time, really, from looking at Peter Lastman's work and working in his studio. Okay. The last thing from Lastman that Rembrandt got was the importance of the traditions of image making, particularly in the north as well. And Lastman had a huge collection of engravings from earlier 16th century artists like Lucas van Leyden. And as you might imagine, Lucas van Leyden, Lucas from the city of Leiden. Okay, that's what his name, Van, is from, right? Lucas van Leyden was one of the most important northern printmakers from around the time of Albrecht Dürer, if you remember that, those of you that intro. And he's carving into a metal plate, right, these little lines, rubbing ink into the lines that he's carved, polishing the flat bits, pressing paper onto it to transfer the ink to the paper. Okay? And they're cheap. They were cheap. They're cheap by comparison now. I mean, you can pick this up for like $30,000. Relatively speaking, right, that's not 30 million. Right? Put some change back in your pocket. But Lastman collected these things and began to sort of update them. And I think you can see how the overall composition, here's just kind of an update of Lucas's composition. Right? And for Rembrandt, this is a huge touchstone because, of course, Rembrandt is also from Leiden. Right? And here is this great artist from 100 years earlier from his own hometown. Right? How would you respond if you were introduced to an artist that you'd never known before from 50 years ago who was right here in North Arlington? You know? You all of a sudden go like, wow, isn't that pretty cool? Right? So he responds very much to Lucas van Leyden. And Rembrandt will begin to collect, as he's collecting costume and props for his paintings, he also begins to collect prints, Rembrandt does. And he has folio on folio on folio of older prints, right? All the way through contemporary artists as well. But he's got them organized. Now, how do we know this? In 1656, there was a bank injunction against Rembrandt because he spent all his money. He was broke. It was basically bankruptcy. But not really. It was more like a Chapter 13 where he's got to declare everything he owns and has a big sale to pay off his debtors. And they inventory his entire house. And that's how we know he had these cases full of, cheap metal armor, right, and textiles, and whatnot, that he would dress people up in because it's in the inventory. And how we know what kind of prints he had, because they would mention he has a folio of prints by Lucas, right? Has a folio of prints by Ribera, Spanish printer at the end of the early 17th century, right? A folio of prints by Italian artists, right? So we know he had this monster collection of prints that he was also drawing upon, right? So again, this is all coming out of Lassmann. This experience is more than just grinding paint for Rembrandt. This really did establish a lot of the things that will work for him through the course of his career. And in fact, here's a Rembrandt print of the Triumph of Mordecai, and you can see it's so similar to the last one, right? If you keep in mind that he's carving this thing in reverse, right, in order to print it, the thing that he's actually working on, the metal plate that he's etching in this case, is in reverse to the image that we see here. And there's old Mordecai with Haman in the foreground, and again, that same sense of sort of humble, almost shame for all the acclaim, right? But Rembrandt gives it a little bit more interesting background with this archway that he's moving through. And again, telling the story through human terms. So he's getting a lot from Peter Lassmann, right? This is a really kind of a crucial part of his career. Okay, so 1622, 1624, Lassmann. A lot of things get sort of set off in Rembrandt's mind that will remain important for him for the rest of his career, even though he's just in his early 20s. Around 1624, he moves back to Leiden, right? For the next 6 or 7 years, he's going to start his career there. And he begins, we think, to share a studio with, or at least be in close collaboration with, Jan Lievens, right? We're pretty sure they shared a studio. And there's a Lievens portrait of Rembrandt, right? And a Rembrandt, another Trony, right? Just this crazy laughing character. One of the things that Rembrandt's doing is he does these different face studies. Is not only is he interested in sort of costumes and how to light those and how those might work into his history paintings, but he's also interested in expression, right? The relationship between the face and feeling, right? The relationship between face and emotions. How does different facial expressions convey different ideas? And so he'll pose himself, he'll pose other people. That etching that's on our canvas page, where he's looking in the mirror and going, ooh, right, is him making faces at the mirror and trying to capture different emotions, right, that will become part of what he does as a painter in these history paintings. But they are ends to themselves at the same time. And you can see each one of these, they're sort of dressed up in this quasi-military armor. It's called a gorget, right, that metal thing around their neck that each of them are in. That gives them the sense of being a laughing soldier or something. It just adds a little something to the story. Or Rembrandt even wearing one, even though we know, of course, it's not. And they're just using each other sometimes. We don't know really what Lievens looked like, so far as I know. So we don't know where there might be a Rembrandt portrait of Lievens. But we're lucky that Rembrandt did so many self-portraits that we know what he looked like. We know that this is him. I was up in Baltimore on Sunday, and there's a Jan Lievens portrait of Rembrandt in Baltimore. We'll see it sort of maybe after we get back, right? I'll bring that into the class as well. So now, while in Leiden, back in Leiden, right, between 1624, 1631, Rembrandt does a number of sort of studies, and so does Lievens, and you can see sometimes it looks as if they're using the same model. Right? These are why we think they're sharing studios. And posing with textiles that suggest a particular religious costume, and doing things that add a certain narrative. But the question is whether or not they are intended to be a religious picture or not. Or are they simply more of these tronies that we've been talking about? These face studies that then become elaborated in more substantial pictures into something more specific in its narrative. Right? So the woman at the left reading two different books, right? Is there any specific narrative there? There's not enough detail to say, right? With Rembrandt's on the right from the Rijksmuseum, some people have suggested that maybe he's giving us a sort of a biblical portrait, if you will, right? A prophet. But at the same time, there's no detail to suggest that that's exactly what he's trying to do. All of this is leading to one of those lessons from Peter Lassmann. He wants to be a history painter, right? That's what Rembrandt's going to try to become, is artist specializing in history pictures. And all of these works, the Laughing Man, the Old Woman Reading, are fodder for that development, right? They're adding to his ability to paint history pictures well. Rembrandt's early work is, for my money, a little spotty. If I can say that, I can get away with saying that. Rembrandt's kind of sucky when he's younger. If you're still in your 20s, soldier on. You'll get better. And here's a history scene. We don't even know what this history scene is. There's still a lot of debate over what actually is going on here. But you can see from the setting, these sort of quasi-exotic Middle Eastern buildings, right? Certainly not Dutch. In the background, all of those pieces of armament. In the foreground, showing his interest in collecting these things to depict them. It looks as if some people have been disarmed here, but it's hard to say what it is. And in the background, behind the scepter, is a self-portrait of Rembrandt. He stuck himself in here as well, right? And that's something that is actually fairly common in art of, really from the 15th century on, is to include portraits within historical scenes, and sometimes self-portraits as well. I like how he's still scratching at his hair, like we saw in his self-portrait, to get the highlights in his hair. And I also like how the guy in the pink next to the fellow in yellow, it's hard to say, it's almost like he's looking at Rembrandt there, up over his shoulder, recognizing that he's there. But he's sort of placed himself within this nondescript historical pictures, doing some honor to this man. And I think that the fellow in yellow is probably a portrait. Right? The costume there is out of keeping with everyone else in the picture. It suggests that might well be a portrait, and the fact that he looks directly at us. Now, like I said, he's spotty. When he's good, he's pretty good. I quite like this picture of Tobit and Anna. The book of Tobit is in the Bible, but it's not in everybody's Bible. It's part of the Catholic Old Testament, right? But it's not recognized, the Book of Tobit is not recognized by the Protestants. And that brings up an interesting point. But Holland's Protestant. The Calvinists are really tolerant, right? They don't want to banish things, even though the official religion is Protestantism. Right? And so they are very accepting of the Book of Tobit, not necessarily as a canonical part of the Bible, but as an ancient writing that's full of potential moral lessons. It's a good book. It's just not authentic, right? And so Rembrandt actually turns to the Book of Tobit often. There's even a book out there on Rembrandt's illustrations from the Book of Tobit, right? And the story is that Tobit's a blind man. That's him in the lower left corner, right? And he can't work because he's blind, right? So his wife is forced to beg, and one day she comes home with a goat, right? And someone gives it to her as an act of charity, knowing that Tobit can't work, right? And so she says, honey, I've got food, right? She's excited. She comes home. Their poverty is sort of illustrated by all of the details in the room, and I've got some details coming up. Instead of rejoicing at the fact that they've got food, Tobit gets angry at her. And he says, you must have stolen this. No one would give us a goat. So he accuses her outright of thievery, of stealing the goat. And he prays to God that he might die of shame because his wife has turned to thievery. Right? Yeah, men. Right? And it's totally, right? It's totally challenging his manhood because he's supposed to survive and he can't, and provide and he can't, and she provides and he's mad at her when in fact you want to. And Rembrandt gets that, right? He doesn't get the sexist part because Rembrandt was a sexist creep, but we'll get to that later. A horrible story about Rembrandt's life. It really is. In the 1640s, he was, dare I say, an asshole. And look, it's on tape. I said that on tape, so you guys can get me fired. I think that one probably flies. Rembrandt gets that dynamic, though, right, of Tobit's pride shattered by not being able to provide, right? And so with these details, right? So here's Tobit praying. Rembrandt early on, and this is true for most of his career, he applies paint really thick, right? It's got a sort of almost a skin quality to it, the way he puts the paint onto the board. And can you see that sort of around his eyes in particular? And you notice the hollow of the blind eyes, but also on his hands. And it's almost as if Rembrandt is trying to make the paint into a sort of relief of what is illustrated there. So with the hands in particular, it almost looks like it's the thickness of the skin, and you almost get the sense that it's thicker where it comes out. Does that make sense? That you could close your eye like Tobit. You could rub your fingers on it, and you could tell what it was, right? And that's even true for his clothing and how, again, the details, right? The details make the picture. So Tobit is poor. He's got nice clothes, but they are trashed, right? So he's got this fur-lined robe from back in the day, but it's been patched on the knees. His elbows are worn through. It's been cobbled together from different kinds of fabric on his sleeve. And here is old Tobit saying, "Oh, I'm so, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my wife is now a thief. And please," you almost hear him, right, in the Old Testament, "Please, God, take me away," right? And just lamenting the fact that his wife has done this. Poverty everywhere with the details, right? So there's the shock. What do Anna's reaction to this is, how could you possibly react this way? And she can't believe her eyes, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because he can't believe his eyes, so to speak, right? Because he's blind. I do love the fact that she looks like the goat. I don't know if he's doing that on purpose or not, but there's something about her face. Rembrandt has a pretty good sense of humor. And I think he's doing that on purpose on a certain level, that she is, there's a kinship between them. The wicker basket, which is your shopping basket, right, your market basket in the back, is broken. And she hasn't even taken it with her, right? She's not, because she can't go out and shop anymore. She's got no money. So it sits there unused and trashed in the background, right? Broken windows behind Tobit. A steady diet of onions because they're cheap, right? Can you imagine that? That's worse than a steady diet of potatoes. Would be a steady diet of onions, right? In the background here, and then other just wonderful. Dogs know when you're mad at each other. When the few times my wife and I get along pretty well, and we don't argue. But you know what? If I get upset about something, or Karen gets upset, last night I forgot to shut a door on one of the cabinets. She hates that, and she got mad at me, and the dog sit in the corner and just, right? And he's a mongrel little dog anyway, right? And the hair hanging in his face, and he's got bells on, right? He has to, because otherwise Tobit's gonna kick him, right? And so there's this little wonderful details that just make this a human story, right? He's got to put bells on the dog because he's gonna step on him otherwise, and the dog's like, "Oh, guys, don't argue." Right? And Tobit's shoes, they've got no toes anymore. You can see the reflection of the fire. And I don't know if this is accurate or not. Don't quote me on this. But I think he's built a fire not in the fireplace, right? There's a fire there in the middle of the room. And I get the feeling that old blind Tobit has got, I'm going to build a fire in the fireplace. He's over here, right? And he's screwed it up because he's blind and he can't figure out where to go to build. But he's built a fire and he's warm. And he's threatening to burn the house down, right? Because it's not in the fireplace. And I think that's part of Rembrandt's humor in the story, right? So the painting, right, it's still fairly early in Rembrandt's career. He's still sort of figuring things out. He's only, at this point, 20 years old or so, right? So sorry if that's doesn't mean it. It's young to me, right? And I couldn't paint or etch when I was 20, right? It took me even beyond that to figure out where I was making art, and he's got it pretty well figured out. You know, he's really making some serious progress. With this particular picture, I want to point out one last thing that will be important for Rembrandt, and that's the thematic choice of his pictures, right? So we talked before about the fact that he grew up the son of a miller, right? A miller's son, in working class, rural sort of environment. That was his upbringing, and he has a tendency to sort of images of the poor seem to appeal to him. Images of poverty, but dignity within that, right? Really seems to appeal to him, and this is our first real strong example of that. Okay? Another thing that seems to appeal to Rembrandt, we're not 100% sure why, is that throughout his career he has a great interest in images of blindness. This seems to be a theme he loves, is images of either people who are blind or people at the moment of revelation, right? The moment of just seeing something, and often seeing something with their spiritual vision rather than their earthly vision. Right? And there's something going on with Rembrandt and blindness and sight and non-physical sight, right, throughout his entire career. And so here we're seeing really our first example of it. But just keep in the back of your mind how often when we look at Rembrandt pictures, especially the ones that have a narrative, that part of the narrative will revolve around the idea of sight or sightlessness, right? And usually not just normal sight, supernatural sight, or sightlessness. And Tobit is sightless, right? It's signed in the lower left corner, so we're pretty sure that it was sold, right? But probably made for the open market, because that was the normal way to sell pictures, right? Was you would do them on spec, and you would sell them out of your studio, right? And that's what we're pretty sure Rembrandt was doing here. Also, from the Leiden years, right, is this image of Jeremiah, the prophet from the Old Testament, who foretold the fact that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And here Rembrandt depicts this image as, again, an image of vision. Jeremiah is in the foreground. The light, almost like a holy light, is shining on him. You'll notice the Caravaggio sort of feel to that, right, with the darkened background. Spotlight that you can't, the light of God, right, that comes from outside of the frame. All these wonderful costume details that we've seen Rembrandt developing, that beautiful red robe that his feet are on, but also the pot and the elements that are in it. And in the background, right, as we work our way through this grotto that Jeremiah is sitting in, we see Jerusalem on fire in the background. That's his vision, right? So again, it's the image of sight, right? But not physical sight. It's his vision that we get to share through Rembrandt's picture. Yeah, Jesse.
It almost looks like you're stepping into his vision.
That's right.
I focus more on the background and the vision that he's having than almost the foreground.
Right. At the same time, what's interesting about that is that when you see the picture in person, and you will, right? That one of the things that Rembrandt does as a painter, and I think this is kind of, there aren't many painters in the audience, but as a painter, one of the things that Rembrandt's very good about thinking about, and these two pictures don't show him developing this, is that paint application, how you put paint on the surface, right, is a choice that can affect how the viewer looks at the picture. Okay? So early on with Tobit and Anna, almost everything sort of is painted the same, right? Everything has the sort of same thickness. There's a swank, not too swank, a scumble, right, of paint. In other words, thick and sort of gooey everywhere. And it's everywhere. Like whether it's the window or Tobit, right, or the wicker basket or the onions, right? With Jeremiah, Jesse, the foreground is much more thickly painted. Right? There's more paint on the panel. And as we get to the background, you can probably see this right around that sort of aura around Jeremiah. You can see it's much more thin, kind of washed out, right? And so when you get in front of it, I think that the effect that you get in the classroom, right, where some of the reflection on the panel has washed out against the top, right? When you get this, see if you have the same effect when we're in the Rijksmuseum, right? as to whether or not the background and foreground have the same punch. Because the background is really thinly painted, right? It's almost like it's a gauze, which makes sense as a vision, because, I can't remember who is it. Is it? It's one of the Old Testament prophets, or it's St. Paul. Talks about seeing things as if through a gauze. And that's how he describes sort of a spiritual vision, right? As somewhat indistinct, because then you don't see the edges so well, right? And visions are supposed to be that way, because they're supposed to make you think about something, not like something you nail it down, right? So, and I've got some details, I think, that show that same sort of thickness of paint application that he has in the foreground. There's some of those wonderful details. Look at my age, right? He's 24 years old. And I'm old enough to now say, he's a kid, right? But look at how well rendered that pewter pot is with those knobs on the side. There's a perspective exercise for you, to try to get that to work in 3 dimensions and filled with those other things, and then the lighting that falls over them. One of the things that Rembrandt is good at, and will always be good at, is where things are in space. He really somehow, if you're trying to render something in 3-dimensional space and you're having trouble, don't look at how it renders. Whether it's in paint or in drawing, it's just extraordinary. Nothing is sort of awkward. Nothing seems to fall forward when it should be behind. And the 3-dimensional quality of that pot full of stuff, right? Everything is locked into place. He's so good with that, right? There's the detail of the Jerusalem that Jesse was looking at in the background. You can see, I think, from this, it's not particularly thickly painted. In fact, there's that brush there that's a bit more, that bush, right? But then behind it, it kind of gets filmy, right? And some of that film is, again, the reflections that we're getting and the oxidization of the paint, right? But it's nowhere near as thick as the things in the foreground. Maeve? Is it what? Yeah, it's burning because Jerusalem is being destroyed, right? So what he's doing is now he's had this vision. God's given this vision of the future of Jerusalem, and he sees that Jerusalem will one day be destroyed. And at this point, it's like, oh crap! But it's a vision. It's gonna come true because God gave it to him, and he does not want it to happen, right? So Rembrandt's what he's doing is he's taking the miraculous, and he is telling it in human terms. So here it is. He's now been told by God something he doesn't really want to come true. Right? So that's Jerusalem burning behind him. And the round building that you see is probably meant to be the Temple of Solomon, which was itself round. Right? And the focus, however, is supposed to be Jeremiah and his human reaction to this, right? The fact that he does not want this to happen. So here's a close-up of his head. And it looks kind of like some of those old men we saw before that Rembrandt was painting, right? And again, that brings up this question of whether or not he's posing people that he knows in these pictures. But how perfectly he captures her sorrow, right? Human sorrow. And also how great he is with skin, right? And how the skin pushes up next to his hand and wrinkles up next to his face, right? Rembrandt's not overrated, right? I really think, some artists are, most of them start with R, are pretty overrated. But Rembrandt, he's pretty good, right, as a painter. Again, from the same early period, another image of sight. In this case, this is the presentation of the temple. It is where Mary and Joseph have taken Jesus for his circumcision, right? They're presented to a priest in the temple. And the priest is, according to Catholic legend, again, even though he's a Calvinist artist, this is all well and good, right? The priest is, by legend, blind. I don't know if this is in the Bible. And says when Christ is put in his lap, given to him for circumcision. Can you imagine that? Circumcision by a blind priest? Yikes! Yeah, well, you don't have to worry about it because you're a girl. Yeah, well, anyway, there's faith for you. In any event, when the blind priest Simeon receives Christ in his hands, he says metaphorically, I have seen the Lord, and now I can find peace. Right? He recognizes Christ's divinity. Right? And so it's another scene of blindness and supernatural sight, right? So there's Simeon, right? Baby Christ in his hands, being and looking up toward God as the rest of the Sanhedrin is around is the Virgin Mary, right? Probably Joseph here in that central grouping. And again, Rembrandt focusing not only on images of sight, but again on this idea of trying to tell stories in human terms, right? There's a nice close-up so you can see. And the importance of costuming and expression, right, for the way he tells stories. At the same time, these other lessons from last month, right? Still a lot of Caravaggio coming through here with the darkened stage set and the bright light shining down from the upper left corner to the upper right corner, illuminating the things he wants us to focus on. Yeah, Jesse.
You may not know this, but I was just curious. Whenever I see paintings incorporating Mary, she's normally always dressed in blue
Yeah.
and white. Do you know why that is?
Oh, yeah. Do you want me to tell you?
Yes, please.
Yes, I know why that is. I answered your question. Yes, I know why. Colors had a symbolic content, and by this time, for Rembrandt, it's because she always is. It's important to remember that with symbolisms that are traditional, sometimes certain artists will just adopt them because that's the way things are, without really sort of necessarily understanding all of the ins and outs of things. However, for the history of art, we know that the three colors that the Virgin Mary wears, which are red, white, and blue, it's not because she's French or American or whatever, right? Russians red, white, and blue as well. But anyway, interestingly enough, white is obviously purity, right? Virginity. Red is sorrow. And blue are two things. One is the color of royalty, right? She would be Queen of Heaven in traditional theology. And again, this is where it doesn't matter to Rembrandt. The other one is that blue was symbolically in the late Middle Ages a color that was associated with faithfulness. And the idea is that she is faithful to Christ's mission, even though as his mother, she should try to protect him. She's got to let him go. And in this case, this is the first time Christ lets blood. This is the first time Christ bleeds, at least insofar as the biblical story tells us, right? And so it becomes, for Catholics, one of the 7 bloodlettings of Christ. I know the word in Dutch, but I don't know it in English, right? One of the 7 sheddings of blood of Christ that become part of the Catholic liturgy. So what's interesting, instead of wearing red to show that she's in tune with suffering, she wears blue because she's faithful to the fact that he's got to shed blood, right? Otherwise, our salvation's nothing. Okay, so there. I do know. Now you know too. Yeah.
I thought purple was the color of royalty.
It translated into blue as well. But purple, you're right. Purple is imperial. Blue is royalty, right? So there's levels of royalty, right? Kings are here, emperors are here, emperors are purple. Okay? So Roman, Byzantine, etc. Right. Another historical scene, we can see with all of these that Rembrandt's right developing his chops, if you will, in history painting. In this case, it's a mythological scene of Andromeda. And again, these are things I had to look up to know what they are. This is from Roman poet Ovid, O-V-I-D, wrote a book called The Metamorphoses in ancient Rome, talked about different gods and their stories. Andromeda was the daughter of Cassiopeia. I know these things because they're in the stars, right? I remember when I was a kid, Dad showed me Cassiopeia up there, and Andromeda was an early Michael Crichton book called The Andromeda Strain about a virus that came from outer space to the world in 1971 or something. Andromeda was the daughter of Cassiopeia, and Cassiopeia, Queen of Ethiopia, bragged that her daughter was more beautiful than anybody in the world. And in addition to that, was more beautiful than the Queen of Heaven, right? Hera, the Queen of Heaven. And as soon as you brag that you're better than the gods, time to run, you know? And as it turns out, the gods got mad at Cassiopeia for bragging that her daughter was more beautiful than the Queen of Heaven, right? and they made her sacrifice her. So they tied her to a rock, and Neptune, the king of the sea, sent this horrible beast to come and devour her. Right? That's the story. So what we see here is Andromeda waiting for her fate. And Rembrandt doesn't show that to us, right? This could be a lot more dramatic. He doesn't show it to us. She's looking off. The light that's coming in is again coming from divine, right? This sea monster that's coming to devour her, that's been sent by King of the sea, Neptune of the sea, the god of the sea. And she's waiting for her, the most beautiful woman in the world. And Rembrandt has based this on prints, but derived it sort of inventively from these prints. So remember with Goltzius, he had learned that it was important to look back at traditions of how stories are told, right? Goltzius looked at Lucas van Leyden. Rembrandt begins to look at other artists who are making works of art. Hendrik Holtzius, who we looked at briefly the first day of class, extraordinary printmaker from the late 16th century, right? Died around 1619, right in there somewhere. So he's a relatively recent artist, right? But prints like these, because you can make multiples of them, end up being very, very well known by people because you can own one and I can own one, right? I don't have to come to your house to see it. So here's Holtzius's version of this, right? Chained to the rock. And the story turns out okay because Perseus, right? Perseus was the one who killed the Gorgon, right? Medusa. Great Greek hero. Ends up saving her as well. And so what Holtzius gives us is Perseus destroying the sea monster in the background. And what Rembrandt has done is sort of taken this and made his own version of it, right? And he still changed her to the rock in the foreground, although she changed by her wrists rather than her legs, right? And in the background, it just becomes this mist that goes off to nowhere. We don't get to see the sea monster, nor do we get to see the solution to the story, which is Perseus intervening and saving her. At this point, her fate is unknown, right? And that kind of amplifies on a certain level the drama that we're talking about, right? Because, wow, who knows what's going to happen next? And in a way, it's almost like, well, I haven't seen it yet, but I mean, like, isn't it Bird Box, you don't ever see any of the monsters, right? Or in The Quiet Place, you rarely see them. Or like an alien, my time period, right? By the time you finally see the alien, right, you're like, holy crap, what is this thing going to be, right? Because you never really see it. It's dark, you see a tentacle, maybe the mouth, right? And that really makes it scarier. Usually when monster movies reveal the monster, it's not scary anymore. It's usually gross, right? But it's rarely as scary as when you don't know what you're dealing with. And so Rembrandt, I think, is heightening the level of drama here, right? By not including the sea monster. Even though Goltzius' sea monster is pretty cool, right? In the background. Now, the other thing that's fascinating about this picture is the storyline, right? So Rembrandt is taking on this story about the most beautiful woman in the world, whose mother has bragged, and her fate is based on the fact that her mother bragged that she's more beautiful than anybody. And the story is not that she isn't, right? The story is that you don't say that you're better than the gods, right? So it's not necessarily about pride, it's about challenging the gods. So Rembrandt gives us a image, front and center, no distractions, of the most beautiful woman in the world, according to ancient mythology, right? Roman mythology. And her body type is not particularly idealized. Compare her to Goltzius's, right? A little bit more trim. Rembrandt's is paunchier. Rembrandt's body type, Rembrandt's sense of ideal beauty, seems to be antithetical to what we usually see in Baroque art, particularly early Baroque art. Now, they tend to be big anyway, but Rembrandt's tend to be particularly lumpy, right? And there is some question as to whether or not Rembrandt is challenging the rules, right? Just in the same way that we saw him using a paintbrush wrong way around. Right? Is Rembrandt actively, as he's establishing himself out there as this artist, right, trying to be the great history painter, is he trying to make things about how he works that are extraordinary, that are special, that merit particular attention by even doing things that run afoul of traditional, idealized beauty. Right? It makes Rembrandt stand out. One last picture, and then we'll quit. Susanna, right? Another Old Testament. Is this Book of Daniel? I have to look it up, right? Where is Susanna from? Yeah, Book of Daniel, right? So Susanna was seen by the elders of the church taking a bath, right? They spied on her. And so what's Rembrandt doesn't give us the elders, right? Just her in the bath. And they get all hot and bothered because she's so beautiful, right? In the book. And they confront her. So she's coming back from the bath. She's covered herself up after they've watched her. And she's going back home, and they stop her on the way home. It's such a creepy story. And they say, if you don't sleep with us, we're going to tell everybody that you met a guy here. Right? And it'll ruin your reputation. That you were going up to the bath to have a fling. So you have to sleep with us, or else we'll tell. And of course, it doesn't work out that way, but that's the threat, right? Right? Vile things. Again, it's an image like Andromeda. That's an image of beauty presented to you, right? By removing the sea monster, it's about you judging whether or not she's beautiful. Again, hey, sight, right? Thematizing vision. In this case, we're the elders in a way, right? We're the ones spying our bath, and she sees us doing it, right? But also, even less idealized of a body, right? And throughout his career, Rembrandt's bodies tend to be working class bodies, right? They don't tend to be athletes or models, right? They are normal looking. Does that make sense?
So more realistic.
Significantly more realistic, significantly more down to earth. And on Friday, when we talked about what makes Dutch Baroque different from other countries, right? There's a really down to earth quality about Dutch art that's often called realism. Although that's not particularly accurate. It's a very altered kind of realism. But right, Rembrandt falls right into that. He gives us images of people that don't look like these Goltzius figures, right? That are just too beautiful for words. In a sort of timeless Renaissance way. Rembrandt is giving us these images of people that look like they might be farm hands, you know, working class people, not supermodels, right? Not Victoria's Secret centerfold. They have centerfold, they don't. You get the idea. Okay, we're barreling through Rembrandt paintings. We'll finish those up on Friday and start talking about prints as well. So be sure to read ahead about Rembrandt's printmaking, right? And we'll see you on Friday.